What Montgomery said in his press conference nearly fractured the Allied command. But what was the real cost of his words? In January 1945, as the Battle of the Bulge raged on, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a man known for his military precision and his confidence, faced the press with an agenda of his own. The Battle of the Bulge, a turning point in World War II, had left the Allies stunned and scrambling. Montgomery, who had been given command of the northern sector after Eisenhower's controversial decision, was about to make his case to the world, but what he said would nearly unravel the hard-won unity between American and British forces. Montgomery's words at the press conference seemed harmless at first, but his casual dismissal of American efforts and his claim that the British forces had been the decisive factor in stopping the German advance were inflammatory. His phrasing suggested that the Americans were incapable of handling the situation on their own, and this angered both the American public and military leaders. The press, eager for a story, latched onto his words, framing them as a self-congratulatory narrative that overshadowed the sacrifices of the American troops who had been fighting in the brutal winter conditions. What Montgomery had intended as a way to highlight the British contribution to the victory had, in fact, alienated his allies. His comments set off a wave of outrage that culminated in General Omar Bradley drafting his resignation, feeling betrayed by his British counterpart. But what had Montgomery done wrong? Had he miscalculated the importance of his words, or was he simply too focused on asserting his leadership? This moment serves as a sobering reminder of how fragile military alliances can be when words, even those spoken with the best of intentions, can cause irreparable damage. The Battle of the Bulge, one of the most intense and critical confrontations of World War II, caught the Allied forces completely off guard. In the freezing cold of December 1944, over 200,000 German troops launched a surprise attack against the American lines in the Ardennes forest. The battle quickly escalated, with American divisions being surrounded and pushed back. The situation seemed dire, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. It was a crisis that demanded swift and decisive action. In the midst of this chaos, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower made the controversial decision to place Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in command of the northern sector of the battle. Montgomery, the British general known for his meticulous planning and aggressive leadership, had already established a reputation for being outspoken and determined. Eisenhower, recognizing Montgomery's proximity to the northern front and his ability to organize forces quickly, hoped his leadership would stabilize the situation. However, Montgomery's command of the northern sector was met with mixed reactions from American commanders. General Omar Bradley, who had commanded American forces since Normandy, was particularly frustrated by this decision. Bradley felt that Montgomery's command over American troops would undermine the trust and morale of the soldiers who had been fighting valiantly. Tensions between the British and American forces simmered beneath the surface, setting the stage for an explosive moment that would change the course of the war, not on the battlefield, but in the press. Montgomery's press conference in early January 1945, where he claimed credit for the success of the Battle of the Bulge and downplayed American contributions, would serve as the flashpoint that threatened to fracture the unity of the Allied command. What began as a military operation would soon become a battle of words that could have torn apart the strategic alliance. The press conference Montgomery held on January 7, 1945, was supposed to be a routine military briefing, but it quickly turned into a lightning rod for controversy. Standing in front of the reporters, Montgomery outlined the success of the Allied forces in the Battle of the Bulge, but his comments about his role were less than tactful. Rather than giving credit where it was due, Montgomery focused heavily on his own decisions and actions. He claimed responsibility for handling the situation in the northern sector, presenting his strategic maneuvers as the key to the success of the operation. Montgomery's words were not simply a recount of military tactics, they were a direct challenge to the contributions made by American forces, particularly those of General Patton. By describing the efforts of the British forces as the decisive factor in the victory, Montgomery effectively minimized the sacrifices and bravery of the American soldiers who had been engaged in the thick of the fighting. His use of the first person, repeatedly saying, "I handled," "I took steps," and "I deployed forces," conveyed a sense of self-aggrandizement that was perceived as deeply disrespectful by the Americans who had fought side by side with the British. The response from the American military was swift and unforgiving. Within hours, reports from the press highlighted Montgomery's arrogance, and American newspapers began publishing editorials that emphasized his condescending attitude toward the American effort. The situation escalated when General Bradley, who had been already frustrated by Montgomery's command of American forces, sat down to draft his resignation. This moment, though sparked by words, had the potential to destabilize the unity that had been so hard-won between the American and British forces. As the public outcry grew, the true cost of Montgomery's words began to reveal itself, not just in the press, but within the command structure of the Allies. Montgomery's words at the press conference were not merely a case of poor judgment, they were a direct affront to the sacrifices made by the American forces during the Battle of the Bulge. His phrasing was telling. By saying things like, "I handled the battle area," and "I deployed the whole available power of the British group of armies," he implied that the British were the central force that had turned the tide of battle. To those listening, it seemed as if Montgomery was downplaying the critical role played by the Americans, especially the 101st Airborne, who had fought and held their ground in Bastogne under impossible conditions. This wasn't just a matter of miscommunication, it struck at the heart of Allied solidarity. American soldiers who had endured grueling conditions, often isolated and without adequate supplies, felt their efforts had been reduced to mere footnotes in Montgomery's narrative. The sense of betrayal was palpable. They had held the line, fighting off wave after wave of German troops, and now, Montgomery was effectively claiming that his role in organizing British forces was the decisive factor in stopping the German advance. His dismissiveness toward the American contribution was seen as both arrogant and disrespectful. The American military brass felt this insult keenly. General Bradley, who had spent years fighting alongside the British and trusted Montgomery, could not stand by while Montgomery took all the credit. Bradley's decision to draft his resignation was not taken lightly. It was not just a protest against Montgomery's arrogance, it was a statement about the value of the American effort and the importance of acknowledging the contributions of every soldier, regardless of nationality. This was not just a political issue, it was a personal one, deeply affecting the morale and unity of the Allied command. Montgomery's failure to recognize the emotional weight of his words revealed a blind spot in his understanding of leadership within the coalition. His comments could have shattered the hard-won cooperation among the Allies during the war's most critical moments. The American response to Montgomery's press conference was swift and unequivocal. Within hours, reports began to surface about the widespread anger and resentment his comments had sparked among the American military and press. The American correspondents who attended the press conference immediately filed stories highlighting Montgomery's dismissive attitude toward the American forces. His repeated use of the phrase, "I handled," seemed to dismiss the hard-fought contributions of American troops who had endured the harsh conditions of the battle. These words, combined with his apparent self-aggrandizement, fueled outrage among the American public and military leaders. The backlash was not confined to the media. General Omar Bradley, already frustrated by the decision to place Montgomery in command of American forces in the northern sector, was deeply offended by Montgomery's treatment of the American contribution to the battle. In response, Bradley drafted his resignation as the commander of the 12th Army Group, a decision that sent shockwaves through the Allied command. Bradley had endured Montgomery's arrogance for years, but this was the final straw. He could not, in good conscience, serve under a general who seemed more interested in self-promotion than in acknowledging the sacrifices of the men under his command. The press in both the United States and Britain picked up on the controversy quickly. American military newspapers, such as Stars and Stripes, ran editorials that condemned Montgomery's remarks as disrespectful and arrogant. British papers, on the other hand, painted Montgomery as the hero of the battle, leading to further discord between the two nations. What had been a unified military front began to show signs of fracture, all because of one man's words. The damage done by Montgomery's press conference went far beyond just hurt feelings, it jeopardized the cooperation that had been essential to the success of the Allied war effort. The unity that had been carefully cultivated over years of shared sacrifice was suddenly in danger of unraveling. The emotional fallout from Montgomery's press conference reached far beyond the high-ranking generals and the military brass. For the American soldiers who had endured the brutal conditions of the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery's words felt like a betrayal. They had fought for weeks in the snow and freezing temperatures, facing overwhelming odds, with minimal supplies and constant German assaults. They had given everything to hold the line, knowing that the outcome of the battle could determine the fate of the war. To have their sacrifice dismissed in such a public and arrogant manner by a man who had not shared their struggle felt like a deep wound. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in Bastogne, had been among the most emblematic of these sacrifices. Trapped and low on supplies, they held their ground, defying the German siege. In the face of near-certain defeat, their resolve had been unshakable. When Montgomery's comments surfaced, it was as though their heroism had been erased, replaced by a narrative where they were mere footnotes in someone else's story. This wasn't just about military pride, it was about the recognition of their humanity, the dignity of their effort, and the acknowledgement that their suffering was meaningful. For the soldiers on the front lines, Montgomery's press conference was not a political issue, it was personal. It undermined the sacrifices they had made, and the public narrative that followed painted them as secondary, lesser contributors to the victory. Many American soldiers, who had been fighting tirelessly to stop the German advance, now felt like pawns in a larger, more politically driven game. The emotional toll of feeling overlooked, of having their bravery reduced to an afterthought, was immense. The hurt was palpable. This vulnerability, the emotional cost of leadership, served as a reminder of how crucial it is for military leaders to understand the weight of their words. In war, where lives are on the line, recognition and respect aren't just a matter of morale, they are what keep soldiers going through the most grueling conditions. Montgomery's failure to acknowledge that caused a rift that threatened to unravel the unity of the Allied command at a crucial moment. While Montgomery's press conference undeniably sparked outrage, it's important to consider his perspective in this situation. Was his self-congratulatory tone truly a sign of arrogance, or was it simply the result of his deep commitment to asserting British leadership during a critical moment? In the context of wartime, where every action and decision is scrutinized, one might argue that Montgomery was simply trying to reinforce the role of British forces in what was becoming a deeply American-led campaign. Perhaps, in his mind, it wasn't about undermining the American forces but rather securing the British contribution to the Allied success. Montgomery had long been a commander who believed in the importance of narrative. He understood that history would remember not just the events themselves, but the stories told about them. The British had been struggling with their own sense of inferiority in the face of America's growing dominance in the war effort. It was possible that Montgomery's words were motivated by a desire to reassert British strength and capability, especially at a time when many saw the American forces as increasingly dominant in the European theater. This doesn't excuse his dismissive comments, but it does shed light on the pressures Montgomery might have been under. Having commanded significant portions of the British forces during crucial battles, Montgomery likely saw himself as the guardian of British military honor. In his view, highlighting British successes in the Battle of the Bulge might have seemed like an essential move to secure the legacy of British forces and remind the world of their indispensable role in defeating Nazi Germany. However, whether Montgomery intended to elevate Britain's position or merely indulge in self-promotion, the consequences were clear: the unity of the Allies was threatened. Regardless of his intentions, the results of that press conference were deeply damaging to the morale of the American military and to the fragile relationship between the American and British forces at a critical juncture in the war. Montgomery's press conference remains a pivotal moment in understanding the fragility of military alliances. What started as an attempt to assert British leadership quickly escalated into a crisis that threatened to divide the Allies at a critical time. The situation that unfolded in the wake of Montgomery's words was a stark reminder of how easily things could go awry when leaders fail to account for the emotions and sacrifices of those they command. What began as a military strategy to share credit for victory nearly fractured the very unity that had allowed the Allies to hold together throughout the war. The unity between the American and British forces was forged in the heat of battle and the shared goal of defeating Nazi Germany. Yet, in that moment, Montgomery's press conference revealed just how quickly those bonds could be tested. The situation could have turned much worse if the American backlash had been even more severe, potentially leading to a fracture in command that might have had lasting consequences on the Allied strategy in Europe. In the end, Montgomery's failure to recognize the emotional impact of his words wasn't just a misstep, it was a reminder of how delicate the balance between military leaders and their troops can be. The consequences of that moment rippled through the leadership structure, forcing both American and British commanders to confront the reality that unity, especially in wartime, is a fragile construct. Had it not been for the restraint shown by the American leaders, particularly General Bradley, the damage to the Allied command might have been irreversible. Ultimately, Montgomery's words didn't just affect the commanders, they affected the soldiers who fought and died for a cause much bigger than their national identities. The lesson from this event is clear: the importance of unity and mutual respect among allies cannot be underestimated. A single miscalculation in how history is narrated can unravel the fabric of cooperation that holds an entire alliance together. Montgomery's press conference in January 1945 serves as a powerful reminder of how leadership in wartime is not just about military strategy but also about managing relationships and understanding the emotional undercurrents within an alliance. In his attempt to assert British leadership during the Battle of the Bulge, Montgomery inadvertently alienated his American counterparts, threatening to fracture the unity of the Allied forces at a time when cohesion was critical to success. The primary takeaway from this incident is the importance of respect for the sacrifices made by fellow soldiers, respect for the contributions of each nation within an alliance, and respect for the delicate balance of command. Leaders, especially in times of war, must remain acutely aware of the power of their words and the ripple effects they can create. Montgomery's failure to navigate this dynamic could have led to irreparable damage not just in military terms, but in terms of morale and trust among the Allies. It was a lesson in humility and diplomacy, one that highlights the critical nature of maintaining alliances, especially in the most testing of times. In warfare, where lives are on the line, the success of a mission is often shaped as much by the strength of relationships as by the strategic decisions on the battlefield. Montgomery's mistake was not simply in his words, it was in forgetting the value of solidarity. The unity between the British and American forces had been hard-won, and it was a fragile thing. In the end, Montgomery's comments could have undone years of careful cooperation, and the lesson learned here is as much about leadership in peace as it is in war. Acknowledging the humanity of those around you, whether they be soldiers or fellow commanders, remains paramount. Reflecting on Montgomery's press conference and its aftermath, one question remains crucial for military leaders, historians, and those involved in high-stakes operations: how do we ensure that communication, especially during times of crisis, fosters unity rather than division? This moment serves as a stark reminder that words have power, power to heal and power to harm. For today's leaders, whether in the military, politics, or business, the lesson is clear: fostering an environment of respect, acknowledging contributions, and maintaining open communication channels can make or break the success of any mission. As we look at modern alliances and partnerships, both international and within organizations, it is vital that leaders take the time to recognize and appreciate the diverse contributions that go into achieving shared goals. Building trust and maintaining unity should always be prioritized over personal accolades. As we study the consequences of Montgomery's words, the broader takeaway is a call for future leaders to cultivate empathy, understanding, and respect for those around them, especially in high-pressure situations. The importance of listening and reflecting on the emotional landscape of your team cannot be overstated. In war, as in peace, leadership is about understanding both the strategy and the human element behind every action. So, how can you, in your own leadership journey, ensure that your words and actions reflect the respect and unity needed to drive success? Take a moment to reflect on the teams and alliances you lead or are part of. How can you strengthen those relationships and foster an environment where respect is at the core?